In a small corner of a quiet lakeside town, a child runs back to his father's pickup truck after hearing a strange sound. Frank, his father, keeps his work secret from the child, promising that it'll be done soon. Frank walks into the dark mines and hears a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere. Deciding to ignore it, he puts on a gas mask and delves deeper into the dank tunnels. Frank reaches their underground laboratory where they produce a substance. His partner is there, cleaning out the remaining equipment. They hear the same guttural sound from earlier. It comes from somewhere farther out in the shadows. Frank lights a flare, and both go out to search of whatever was making the noise. A few moments pass, and the two partners find artifacts dangling from the metal pipes. As they guess where these dangling bits came from, the guttural sound becomes louder and louder. Not only is it getting louder, but it is also coming much, much closer. Their screams are followed by a few panicked gunshots. The two partners are then dragged into the shadows by an unseen entity. Outside, wondering where his father has gone, the child also walks into the hungering shadows of the mine. 3 weeks later, Julia stresses over her new teaching position. She takes her time adjusting to the teaching life. She teaches a class on the importance of storytelling. Principal Booth arrives shortly to observe Julia. Julia asks the class to share any fairy tales or myths that they may have come across. A lone student raises her hand to give an answer. Julia, ignoring the lone student for now, tries to get the others to participate. She calls Lucas, a distant and young boy who is lost in his drawings. Getting no answer from the young boy, Julia concedes the answer to the lone girl raising her hand, who then answers, Goldilocks. While the girl explains the story, Clint secretly calls Lucas's attention as he suggestively plays with a sock monkey toy underneath their desk. The school bell rings, and the class goes out to leave. Their bags are laid out in front of the schoolyard. Lucas goes up to his bag and finds the sock monkey toy inside his bag. From across the schoolyard, Clint makes another suggestive gesture just as he leaves laughing with his friends. With some light rainfall, Lucas walks away from town. He arrives at the lakeside and spots a skunk sniffing pebbles. Lucas, with intent in his eyes, picks up a sizable rock from the shoreline. Lucas arrives home with the now deceased skunk in hand. He approaches a bolted door and, with a heavy breath, unlocks it. Somewhere in town, Julia waits in line at a convenience store. She eyes the liquor bottles, but decides to take home a pack of mints instead. A radio broadcast discusses mountaintop mining as Julia gets ready to turn in for the night. She finds herself looking at the piano across the living room. Seeing this, she remembers her younger self, scared and hiding from a shadowy figure walking down into the basement. Sheriff Paul, Julia's brother, greets his sister back home and asks how she's settling in. Julia shares that things are not as she hoped for them to be. Seeing his sister stressed with her time around the piano, he offers to get the instrument removed. Julia promptly declines and assures her brother that things will be all right. With her brother out of the room, Julia looks at the pictures across the wall. She takes some of them down. Back in his room, Lucas looks at a picture of his family. He takes out the sock monkey toy and, with a small knife, proceeds to cut off its head. He hears a loud thumping just across the room, behind the locked door. The morning after, Paul searches for his bottle of medication. Having rearranged the house, Julia directs him to it and promises not to move stuff around anymore. She says that she will be moving out soon to lessen the burden on her brother. Paul assures his sister that he wants her around and that he's just tense about an upcoming eviction. He also thanks his sister for taking the teaching job. Class starts, and Julia asks the class to show their reading assignments. She calls Lucas to tell his story. The boy hesitates for a bit, but eventually stands shakily. Looking at some of his drawings, Lucas reads a story about 3 bears, Big Bear, Little Bear, and Baby Bear. The story takes a grim turn as Lucas describes how Big Bear and Baby Bear transform out of their shared hunger. Concern shows on Julia's face as Lucas ends his story. During the break, Clint finds dog droppings in his bag. He sees Lucas standing at the school doors and, out of spite, pins the boy's face against the door. Julia accompanies Lucas to the school clinic. Later, she even finds Lucas's address and contact details in his medical record. Julia calls the phone at Lucas's house. With no one answering, a rabid thumping grows louder behind the locked door. Through the keyhole, a wildly angry eye lays in wait. The school day ends, and Julia makes her way to her car. She notices Lucas walking alone and secretly follows him to an ice cream store. Trying to befriend the boy, Julia invites Lucas in to get some ice cream. After making him comfortable, Julia asks Lucas about his brother. Lucas asks how the teacher has come to know about him having a brother. Julia tells him that teachers know everything. Lucas says that his brother is back at home. Asked about his mother, Lucas says that if teachers did know everything, Julia would have known about how his mother isn't around anymore. Julia tries to reconnect, telling the boy that she knows what it's like to lose a mother. Lucas tells Julia about his younger brother, Aiden, and how he spends most of his time with their father. With Julia trying to find out more about the father, Lucas gets up to leave, warning his teacher not to follow him anymore. Walking home, Lucas finds the mangled body of an animal. He takes out a plastic bag to pick up the remains. Meanwhile, Julia arrives at Lucas's house. She knocks at their door, but no one answers. She hears a wild thumping from inside and, despite the unlocked front door, declines to go in any further. Back at home, Julia reassembles Lucas's torn-up drawing of a monster. She sees that the monster has a bearded man trapped inside its bloodied maw. Distracted, she is easily shocked as Paul approaches her. Julia tells Paul that he has every right to hate her after she left their home 20 years ago. Paul understands, promising his sister that all he did was pray for her to come back. Back at their house, Lucas prepares the meat he collected earlier and slices it into cleaner and smaller pieces. He takes it to the locked door and sets it on the floor. Not long after, a grimy humanoid figure grunts as it darts towards the food. It immediately retreats after taking its share. With the humanoid retreating into the dark, Aiden, Lucas's younger brother, comes closer and accepts the food that Lucas brought. With the humanoid grunting wildly, Lucas is forced to leave the room quickly, securely bolting it from the other side of the door. To collect her thoughts, Julia plays a melody on their piano. She feels a hand clasped tightly around her neck as she remembers a man and weakly shaking on a bed. Paul wakes Julia from her trance. As she tries to calm down, Julia asks her brother about Frank Weaver, Lucas's dad. Paul explains that the man was a addict who he saved a couple of times before. Julia admits that the drawing from earlier came from Lucas, and that it may relate to his relationship with his dad. She suspects that Frank is hurting Lucas. As Lucas draws in his notebook, Aiden calls to him from behind the locked door. Lucas puts on headphones and hugs a doll to block out the noise. The following day, Lucas prepares some traps in the forest. He hides among the tall tree roots as he hears another person walking around. It's ex-Sheriff Stokes, shocked and standing in front of the half-buried and mangled body of another man. Stokes, fearing what may be out there, quickly leaves the forest. Julia digs around Lucas's school desk, searching for clues. She finds books about animal trapping and dangerous spirits. She pulls out Lucas's sketchbook and brings it to Principal Booth. Julia tries to explain that Lucas is being abused at home. Booth says that, while they can try and come to that conclusion, neither of them are experts on the matter. Julia claims that Lucas may just be trying to get attention. Unfazed, Julia stands firm that Lucas is being abused by his father, and the principal concedes, promising to meet with Lucas's father to clear things up. Paul finishes interviewing Stokes and tells Julia about the mangled body in the forest. As night falls, Lucas visits Aiden. The younger brother is fearful that their father's words about God not being there for them could have been true. Lucas tells him not to forget what their mother said either, about them being born under the lucky star. Lucas gives Aiden some treats. Shortly, the younger brother has trouble breathing and he begins to cough up black liquid. The following day, the discovered body is brought to the morgue. There, Paul meets with the attending physician. The physician struggles to explain that the body took damage from something human-like. Booth drives out to Lucas's house. She walks around the property looking for a way in. With Lucas sitting in class, no one human, is home. Booth enters the house, calling out for Frank to meet her. She hears a crying voice as she walks down the hallway and finds herself in front of the locked door. She carefully unlocks it. Carrying a dimly lit lantern, Booth enters the dank room. Atop a flight of stairs, she sees Aiden. She immediately walks up to him, trying to give some comfort to the starving child. The humanoid creature appears behind her and immediately swats her away. Booth and the humanoid wrestle for control. The humanoid bites down onto her hand, then deeply into her neck, silencing her screams. The humanoid continues to feast on her, having eaten human flesh. The humanoid contorts as a pair of bloodied antlers sprout out from its mouth. Paul and some of the town's police force arrive at the abandoned mine. Stokes finds a set of dangling artifacts. He explains that these are wards, a defense against something, and a piece of an antler. Shortly, Paul receives a garbled message from one of his officers about a missing person report. Walking home, Lucas hears something coming from deep within the forest. He goes in and finds Clint waiting for him. As Clint tries to provoke Lucas, a horned creature gurgles from atop the trees. It pounces on the stunned Clint, crushing him into the dirt. Lucas makes a run for it. Lucas makes it home, but sees a car parked in their driveway. As realization creeps up his throat, he runs inside and discovers a trail of blood leading into the once locked door. Panicked, he begins to clean the scene and hide the parked car. Paul confronts Julia about Principal Booth's reported disappearance. Julia explains that Booth went to Lucas's place to talk with Frank. Learning this, Paul leads a search team. Arriving, Paul calls out to Frank. Lucas, for fear of what is to come, simply hides in the shadowed corners of their house. Over the days, more and more people go missing. Paul calls the succession of events a simple coincidence, which angers Julia. She suspects that Lucas knows something. Later, Julia drives out to Lucas's place, determined to find out more. She unveils the tarped-over car and discovers that it belongs to Principal Booth. Shortly after, accompanied by Paul and a forensic team, she also discovers the mangled body of the principal inside the house. They also find the charred corpse of Frank Weaver, who appears to have had something burst out of him. Julia stops Lucas from entering the house. She brings him to a hospital, where he is diagnosed with a lot of problems. The doctor reports that Lucas has suffered a level of Julia offers to take care of Lucas. Paul disagrees, saying that Julia doesn't have to bring their past down on the boy. Julia explodes, claiming that she, as another victim of has a responsibility to someone like Lucas. Laying on the hospital bed, Lucas remembers how his father devolved into his sickly state. In the flashback, Frank, noticing that he is rapidly losing control, installs the locks on their door. He explains to his kids that, no matter what, never open the door. After a while, Aiden got sick too, and had to be locked in the room with Frank. Lucas remembers roaring in confusion as his father pounded on the locked door. Jules and Paul drive out to meet Stokes to consult him about Lucas's drawings. Stokes presents the antler they found in the mines and explains the myth of Wendigo. He tells them of the Wendigo's weakness. They must extinguish its heart. On their drive back, Paul is called to go to the train tracks. There, they find half of Clint's body, denying the possibility of the Wendigo. Paul takes his medication as he confronts Julia about the disappearances. Julia, having heard enough, demands to be taken back to the hospital to get Lucas. Later, Officer LeCroy arrives at Paul's driveway. Paul instructs LeCroy to keep guard as he finishes convening with the town mayor. In front of warm fire, Julia tries to connect with Lucas again and admits how she lost her father too. Lucas asks if she was around when it happened, but Julia admits she wasn't. Lucas asks if Julia loved her father. Julia, avoiding the question, explains that she came back to the town because of Paul. Julia tries to tell Lucas that his father is gone, despite Paul discovering his father's charred remains. Lucas confidently says that it was his old dad, sick and mean, that is gone. Lucas explains that his new dad needs to be kept fed. That way, Lucas will be loved. It is only a matter of time before his new dad will come and take him down into the mines to be with his brother, Aiden. Just then, a shrieking howl echoes through the town. The officer patrols the area and calls Paul, warning him about a presence hiding in the shed. Paul races home, ringing the house phone. Julia tries to keep Lucas safe, but the young boy is determined to see his brother again. LeCroy, shining his flashlight ahead of him, approaches the shed. There, he finds Aiden in a crate wrapped in a blanket. He rings Paul to report what he found. As he does, and with Paul tragically trying to reach him, a pair of antlers immediately pierce through the officer's chest. With a gurgling screech, the officer's body falls to the ground. Paul gets home and Julia tries to meet him. Seeing that her brother is making his way towards the shed, she tries to stop him. With Julia distracted, Lucas makes his escape and runs out to the driveway. Paul sees the cold body of his fellow officer and tries to wake him. He then sees Aiden, whom he tries to help up, but is swatted away by the same antlers that mangled LeCroy. He smashes against the shed wall, heavily dazed. Aiden runs out just as the creature climbs atop the shed's roof. The creature shrieks from outside the shed as Paul struggles to stand. The officer hears the creature's heavy breathing behind the thick wooden walls, thinking himself to be safe. The creature rams its head through the wall and pierces Paul through the arm with its antlers. Paul picks up a metal pipe and takes a couple of stabs at the horned beast. The creature pulls back, and Paul slumps to the wall, unconscious. Julia comes out of hiding and looks out into the foggy night, illuminated only by the flashing police car lights. She calls out for her brother. Julia finds the shed in pieces and her brother on the floor. She wraps a bandage around Paul's arm and tells him that she'll be going to mine to save Lucas from the Wendigo. A heavy rain falls as Julia arrives at the mine. Julia calls for backup to get her brother some immediate medical attention. She takes a gun with her as she gets out of the car. Julia enters the dark mine, carefully shining her flashlight as deep as possible down its dank tunnels. Hoping for a response, she calls out Lucas's name. As she goes deeper into the tunnels, the dangling wards come into view. Putrid air claims the tunnels as Julia's flashlight illuminates a chamber of bones and abandoned mining equipment. She spots Aiden and Lucas behind a machine. Lucas tells her urgently to get back. As she shines her flashlight across the two, the light catches the mangled body of a black bear. Feeding on it is a hulking mass of hair, bone, and wet flesh. In front of her stands the ancient and horrific visage of the Wendigo, bearing the torn-off face of Frank Weaver on its bony maw. The Wendigo's chest glows with a dim light. Seeing this, Julia takes aim and fires her gun at it. The Wendigo swats her away. Julia drops her gun and her flashlight, which plunges the mines into absolute darkness. Julia crawls across the dusty mine floor, trying to grab at her gun. She shoots helplessly at the Wendigo's glowing chest and lands a non-fatal hit. Julia picks up a flare and lights it in the face of the Wendigo. In surprise, the Wendigo takes a step back, giving Julia enough time to pick up a piece of spare piping from the ground. With all her might, lit by the slowly diminishing embers of her flare, she plunges the pipe into the Wendigo's chest. The Wendigo struggles to keep its footing, but pulls the pipe out of its chest easily. As the Wendigo reaches for Julia with its bloodied claws, Lucas stabs the massive creature in the back with a small knife. With the knife wedged in its back, the creature falls to the ground. Julia, to ensure that the Wendigo stays deceased, takes the knife and digs into the creature's chest. She goes after its fiery heart and rips it out. In the darkness, Aiden cries out in a shrieking voice. He is transforming into the same creature his father did. Julia, knowing what must be done, takes the knife again and walks towards Aiden. Lucas steps in front of her, telling her not to worry and that Aiden just needs to be taken care of. Julia tries to reason with Lucas that Aiden is never going to get any better. As hope fades from Lucas's eyes, he turns his brother over to Julia. Julia holds the shrieking Aiden in an embrace. She holds the knife in her hand, readying herself for the task at hand. As Lucas shields his ears from the horrors to come, Aiden's shrieks echo through the tunnels as Julia takes it. Some time later, Julia, Lucas, and Paul find themselves looking out across the lake. Julia will be keeping Lucas in her care. Paul fears that one day Lucas will turn out like his father and brother. As Julia and Lucas walk away, Paul develops a heavy cough. Looking at his hand, to his horror, he sees a familiar black sludge coating his fingers.